Yeah.
All right, you guys can see that okay?
Yes.
Okay, well, it's obviously a small group, it's casual, so I'm gonna just kind of give you guys a little bit of this overview presentation, and I mean, stop anytime you want to ask any questions. It's gonna be, really kind of top level stuff. So it looks like you guys have the book though, so I guess you can just dig in and find out. If you have any questions about anything you see in there, just let me know. I'll say this is a little bit of it's been really interesting for me. I as I mentioned, I'm a associate professor in the School of Design at the University of Cincinnati. I've been a practicing designer for just over 20 years now, which is kind of hard to believe, but I started my career as what we called an interaction designer back before UX was really a term. Was designing for the web and some very early, very small phone-sized screens back in the day, which was a blast. And then until it wasn't, I guess it started to be less fun. And I've bounced around and have done a lot of different things, from interaction design and UX design to brand development to working. I was running a design department in an art museum for a long time, doing exhibition design. I've worked with some pretty large, transdisciplinary teams doing branded environments, architecture, kind of all over the place. And have kind of fallen into this hybrid academic space, being, teaching, doing research, and continuing to practice. Although my practice today is a bit more in the realm of consulting. So I do quite a bit of consulting right now around strategic foresight and design strategy, that kind of thing. And of course, I'm just now wrapping up my coursework in transition design at Carnegie Mellon. But I start saying all this stuff because the book it's like a criticism really from the inside out. And I like to start with this Mr. Gotcha cartoon, because I think it sort of summarizes just all the paradoxes of what I'm talking about, which is that I am a designer, and because I've been running my own practice for over a decade now, I'm also a business owner, technically. And so I love this little cartoon where the guy, like living under like a feudalist monarchy or something, is like, we should improve society somewhat, and then the like troll pops out like, yeah, you participate in society, curious, like, gotcha. And it's just, I like to start here just to acknowledge that, it is like this. It is an internal critique. It is full of contradictions, but it's also, to me, the like a way to think about how transitions come about, which is through, my approach to practicing design, or my view of design practice, and really from the inside out. Is it okay?
Mm-hmm.
Can you see? Are you okay? And I should also say, I mean, the book release itself is interesting because I wrote it 2 years ago, and it just came out last month, and so it came out in the midst of me beginning this PhD experience, but also it's leading to new kinds of conversations that I like fully anticipate. So I was giving a version of this presentation just a week or so ago to a bunch of UX designers at Google, and it was just like talking about the end of capitalism at Google was really interesting, but it was a great conversation and led to some really exciting possibilities. At a place like Google that also has like 1,000 UX designers working there. Since it's a futurist group, I just thought I'd give my kind of like futurist background. I did study strategic foresight at the University of Houston in their like executive education professional certification program. So I think some of you probably know Adam Cowart, who's also in the PhD program in transition design, and also teaches at the University of Houston. And I bring it up just because they have developed this framework foresight model, which is really specific just approach to doing foresight work. And this is the kind of the particular lens that I've taken for doing this kind of work. And you'll find in the book, chapter 7, I think it is, I really kind of describe this particular process. So for the reader who's, you guys probably will be a little bored by it, but for the reader who doesn't really understand strategic foresight, trying to understand how I have used this as a device to imagine possible futures, and I do it in a comparative way using scenario archetypes to think about what a baseline future might look like and what a transformative future might look like, to try to show that as any kind of I think responsible futuring practice would admit, the future is of course multiple, but it's also dynamic. So how people in large groups of people, or how practices or how disciplines or how organizations respond to change has a lot to do with what the range of possible futures actually look like. So what is this thing that I've called Design After Capitalism? It has, I think, a lot to do with my recognition as somebody who, I guess, lives between teaching, research, and practice. We have what I see as these really like compounded, interconnected contemporary crises: climate change and all the sort of challenges around social inequity and social inequalities, both within the United States, which is where I have spent my life, but also looking at how that has global implications as well. And so, my sort of slow burning recognition, I guess, of this issue was that I think it's difficult to untangle these two from each other. I think it's also difficult to untangle these two from capitalism, and it took me a very long time to come to that notion. But I also think it's like, if we're going to take the idea that design, writ large, has the capacity for systemic change, then I see thinking about a kind of design that's oriented towards moving past capitalism, sort of getting out of capitalism, like, not like just destroying it, but or smashing it, in a kind of revolutionary way. But I use the term erosion quite a bit, like eroding its way towards a different way of doing things, which I believe has interrelated effects with climate change and social inequity as these other crises. So in the discourse of decolonization, in the discourse of sustainability writ large, I think that it's difficult I think we can't probably focus on all these things at the same time, but I think this is another important aspect to focus on because it is related to these two. Hope that came out clearly enough. I also admit, some of you may know Jonathan Chapman. I've heard him say this a bit, and I think it's kind of true. He says, most people, and I'd say designers included, don't really think about the economy that much. Few people really maybe have the bandwidth to think about something as sort of like large, abstract, and kind of complex, that may, beyond the realm of their daily lives, their daily challenges, and even some of the maybe existential issues that people have in their daily lives around those other crises I just mentioned. People don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about it, I don't think. And I think that, economy and its relationship to design is also, there's like a pretty thin, I think, back history on that as far as scholarship goes. But the other point is just that the economy as like a singular thing also just doesn't exist. I mean, that is not a single thing. And to make that point, I'm referencing here an image from J.K. Gibson Graham, which is actually a pseudonym for two feminist economic geographers who wrote under this name together. And their argument about this diagram is to say that what we consider to be the key characteristics of capitalism, which is people selling their labor for money, for a wage, that a firm is going to translate that labor into products that they're going to sell for a profit, and then the person's going to take that money and go buy the goods that they need for their life. I mean, that's kind of like, those are like the key characteristics. But if we look underneath the waterline of this iceberg, anywhere and everywhere you look, you're going to see a much more hybrid collection of activities in terms of how people are making value, how people are exchanging value, how needs are being satisfied, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so whether that's within families, within neighborhoods, within churches, within organizations like special interest clubs at a university, or whether it's within universities, or things that are maybe more directly organized in a sort of non or anti-capitalist way, like cooperatives and worker-owned enterprises and things like that. There's always all of these other kinds of things going on. So all of this is kind of back to the argument that it's not this one or the other, or this kind of binary thing. It's about how do we think about the ways in which design operates in a certain kind of way, and has maybe the opportunity to bring attention to, or nurture, or help flourish some of these other models of value production and exchange. I want to say one more thing too here. I guess I think one of the things that's interesting to me about this, is somebody who has practiced design for a long time, I'll say, is that I'm always kind of in this middle position as a designer. I think that's what's really interesting. So kind of going back to this argument about the capacity for systemic change, I have been in lots of positions where I've been sort of granted the authority to make decisions that move around a lot of money, a lot of labor, a lot of research, a lot of technology or technical development, a lot of materials. I mean, often as designers, we are in situations where we are kind of directing the flows of like large quantities of those kinds of things. And I don't do it of my own volition. I'm always accountable to other people when I'm doing that. But I am in a position to make decisions that can shift the dial and can shift the dial. I think even going back to this diagram, to things that are outside this, you know, definition of a kind of a capitalist exchange. So obviously I'm talking about the book. Looks like you have the book, so I didn't have to describe this, but I'll just say I'm going to talk about kind of high level stuff, but I did organize it in a very specific way. I thought very much about, as an educator, I thought very much about design students in particular, or I should say students more broadly when I wrote this. I wrote it in 3 sections, thinking that you might be able to use it in different ways. The first section is called Diagnosis and Critique, and I do kind of like a deep historical analysis of, you know, again, a particular perspective from admittedly like, you know, Western American perspective on the development of the modern professions of design in the United States and Europe, but looking at how that is integrated into this much deeper history of the birth and kind of expansion of capitalism, and also relating that to a history of, again, particularly Western, but a history of economic theory. And that's just something that I guess I hadn't seen before. I thought it was important to do kind of that background work to set the stage for making a critique of where we are today and then thinking about where we might go next. So that's, yeah, going back to the the cone. The original cone was, you know, went in both directions. So I want to make sure I went deep into history before going forward. The second section is about alternatives, and this is where I've included a lot of case studies as well as theory around, you know, different economic models. They're organized around things that have been explicitly anti-capitalist, things that I think are just that have been organized in kind of outside the capitalist framework, and then things that are specifically, to me, represent maybe some like fragmentary ideas of what a post-capitalist alternative to design could look like. And then in section 3, I do the future looking bit, which is like, you know, doing the foresight bit, making some scenarios and thinking about how to get there. And then I try to make it as practical as possible for a book that's largely theoretical. Have a list of, I think it's 63 very specific guidelines for designers to consider at the level of project, making and sort of operating a design practice of some kind, whether that's a studio or a design team within a company or an organization, but also thinking about the discipline. How do we think about the ways in which do we change our practices so that the discipline becomes something different as well. Okay, I'm gonna pause. I have, you know, just getting started here, but any questions so far? Any comments, or just keep going?
Can you come to the front? The microphone's a little.
Hi, my name is Narchis. I am a grad student over here. I don't know if you've gone over it already or not, because I was like 5-10 minutes late. But I was wondering, like, ever since I looked at the book, the content that it has, I was wondering if the readers should, or would you ideally want them to draw the distinction between the healthy and the unhealthy form of capitalism, particularly like, let's say, traditional capitalism versus neoliberal capitalism. Is that something that one should expect going in, or is it all just, you know, I mean, I'm not in favor of capitalism at all, but I was just wondering if there is a need of drawing the distinction between what the theory says versus how the practice becomes.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. So I will say that I don't put it in that language. I mean, I don't sort of call it healthy versus unhealthy capitalism, but I think there is like to me a fairly clear acknowledgement in the book that, one, it's not that, I mean, I think capitalism has always had some negative tendencies to it, right? And those have existed and have been criticized for as long as capitalism has existed. I do think, and I'll get a little bit more into this in a minute here, but I do think one of the I think one of the main points I'm trying to make in the book is that it is completely different than it has been. And I myself, as somebody who was, born in the previous century or millennium, I think along with a lot of people I've encountered, including I think my students today, I think the kind of capitalism that we have now is one that we still don't really understand. I think one that we haven't like fully grappled with the changes in how value creation is handled, but also what the changing landscape of property really means and what the implications of that are. And so maybe more to your point, I try to make it clear in the book, it's not so much about healthy versus unhealthy capitalism, but it's also acknowledging that one, capitalism has done some really good things, but it doesn't really have an off button or like an enough button. And so the need for infinite growth that's stitched into the system is really a problem now. It has made for productivity and has made for certain amounts of free enterprise that were previously not possible under many previous systems, which I think are all good things. And I'm all for free enterprise. I don't think markets themselves are going to go away. It's not about like money needs to go away, but how is it that we make and produce the physical goods that we need? How is it that we make and produce the informational or cultural goods that we consume? And who gets to sort of steer those decisions, but also participate in the I guess the definition of what's property or how things get produced, I think is part of the argument here. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I do think that a certain combination of scale, like of the bigness of some things, but also the jump from an industrial to a post-industrial economy is part of what the book's trying to point at.
No, yeah, understandable. Yeah, it helps because I think the main part of the question was that should we draw a distinction or not? But then it helps to know that regardless of the distinction, the things that have turned out to be, they're unhealthy. So yeah, thank you so much. That's all.
Sure. Yeah, I hope that helped a little bit. And we can come back to that too after the presentation if it's still kind of, I don't know, I mean, uncertain, or just to talk about it, because again, I'm trying very hard not to make this kind of binary distinction at all. I mean, I will say that there's a lot of references in the book. And part of what I thought I was doing a little bit was like, reading a bunch of books so my students don't have to. I guess it's a way of putting it. But I mean, I spent, I think, quite a bit of time, studying this topic that I didn't really know very much about, honestly. So I mean, going back to the comment, like most people don't think about the economy. Most designers don't think about the economy. I didn't really think about the economy for, a good long portion of my adult life and career. I think I was kind of in the early stages of my career when the 2008 financial crisis happened, and that had a big influence on my life. I mean, that was probably the first moment I really realized, like, wow, this is really messed up. This doesn't make any sense. But I didn't really probably have the ability to, I guess, like think much further beyond, like, this is messed up. But I think that's what started to pique my interest. And anyway, so I've kind of roughly organized it here just to show, I mean, there's like a huge literature on after capitalism and post-capitalism, and it's coming from a lot of different places. You can find it in sociology, political science, philosophy, digital culture studies, media studies. I mean, you can find it kind of all over the place. And it's not, I didn't see it being all that present within design. So I thought that was a literature that it was important to bring into design. Critiques of capitalism, of course, have existed since there was capitalism. So there's plenty of that, but just trying to bring in some of the key arguments there. And then, there is this growing body, I think, of kind of, how and why and in what directions design might need to change, kind of a broad literature on that. So try to bring some of those things into it as well. Joke about it, like, I wrote a book. You wrote a book? Yeah, I wrote a book. It's but maybe not everybody wants to read design theory books, and that's cool. I did spend some time building out a collection of other tools or other things to go with it. You can find that at designaftercapitalism.org. But there are, lecture videos that I made so that it would make it easier for people to, either, consume or the ideas, like think about the ideas or share them or teach them. Recommended reading lists, a glossary, so you can, maybe learn some economic theory along the way. All the case studies, all the practical guidelines are there, readers' guides, teachers' guides. And of course, I made a version of the book in memes because I thought that might be a preferred reading method for some people. So we're just, if you prefer memes, you can read it that way. So again, I think another part of this idea is just, book's a book, but I'm really interested in thinking about how people use these ideas or use this kind of directionality in some way. There's a big story in here about technology and how we use technology and what we do with it, and it's not just sort of like what's possible, but how do we stitch that into the kinds of social and political and cultural systems that we have, and kind of how we steer those towards where we want to go. I grew up in the Detroit area, so there's kind of a Detroit vibe here, but it's definitely the fact that the last century of that city's history, and like my family's history is very attached to that city, is kind of is like an exaggerated version of the story of the rise and fall of industrial capitalism in an American city. And so, this is like a really interesting moment, which is all the way back in 1961, which was when the first programmable industrial robot was put to work on an assembly line this is at a GM factory outside Trenton, New Jersey. And so this is Unimate. Unimate's our first industrial programmable robot. And of course, Unimate is sort of the ancestor to so many other forms of automation that many of which are becoming, I guess, much more disembodied, through things like AI and other kinds of technologies. But I think this idea of automation and like what we do with it is kind of a big part of this story. And I'm trying to tell like a little bit of a joke here too, with like Ford was right, Keynes was wrong. And I guess the joke is that, Henry Ford had this argument, again, like not to say he was like a great person or that industrial capitalism itself was great, but his economic logic as a business owner, as a capitalist, was that he had to pay the people that worked in his factory enough money to buy the cars that they were making. Otherwise the whole thing just didn't work. If you couldn't afford to buy the car as someone who worked at the factory, like this model for like industrial development just wasn't going to ever fly. But if we look at the kinds of changes that took place, we're looking at data from the United States, and again, I'm not an economist, but I can read this chart. It is this sort of transitionary moment when a lot of things start happening with automation of the kind of industrial production aspects of society, in which the kind of like a certain kind of globalization of labor starts to happen, and in which we start to see this decoupling of the kinds of economic productivity that are happening from what people are actually being compensated. And so, I mean, there's like layers and layers and layers to this. We also have a feminist movement, which starts putting women in the workplace, which I think is a good thing, but it also suddenly changes the dynamics of having like 2-earner households, and like the space between what it takes to do labor and maybe like work a 40-hour work week and make a living start to really decouple, and to see over longer than my lifetime, average compensation has moved very, very little, while productivity has increased greatly. And I guess the joke here is about John Maynard Keynes, who was a British economist I mentioned in the book, and he had this idea in the 1930s that he believed at the rate of technological innovation he was seeing at that time, that based on that, he predicted that his grandchildren would only need to work about 15 hours a week. And in a rather hilarious interview a few years ago with his grandchildren, who are all about, in their 60s now, they were, the interviewer was asking, like, was grandpa's prediction right? Did you work 15-hour weeks? And they were like, oh no, it was like 60 hours weeks most of my career. So like what we're doing with these things is not really going in the direction that even economists 100 years ago had in mind. And so a lot of this points to the fact that it is this thing we call capitalism is the form that we have now. It is not an economy of things anymore. And I think that's kind of a simple statement, but that's also kind of a profound thing that we have to I think we still haven't fully grappled with what that actually means, even as we've adapted as designers or entrepreneurs or whatever it is. And so, the idea of how the digital economy functions around different kinds of property and different kinds of assets and different kinds of value is something that people are, kind of making explosive amounts of money and being able to innovate in all kinds of new ways. But it really does shift the kind of the kind of power and social dynamics and political dynamics that come out of this new economy. And so this is, I think, an interesting book from Nick Cernick, who's a Canadian kind of digital studies scholar, really looking at the different kinds, like the nature of platforms as an economic model and the nature of different kinds of platforms within the economy. But it's really about, as far as in as much as platforms have a pretty strong command on economic power in our contemporary system, that it is the way that platforms sort of set the ground rules and create the plane for exchange, that these become vectors of information, which we know can be very, very valuable. And so basically, property of a platform and being able to set the rules of a platform goes a very long way to wielding economic power, which turns into other kinds of power. And that means that design, of course, is no longer a discipline of things either, which I think you guys probably are well aware of, but it does sort of bring up the fact that the kinds of value creation that are happening in contemporary design practices are, far more slippery, in terms of what they are. Like, what does it mean to, create a brand? What does it mean to create an experience? What does it mean to create a branded experience, which is, hypothetically, it's a kind of property. It's a kind of ownership over something. And of course, this is where I think the greatest, this is where I think design's primary form of value creation exists in our economy today. So, there are some big contradictions, I think, between the two different models, the industrial version that was and the post-industrial version that is. And this is Paul Mason, who says everything comes down to the struggle between the network and the hierarchy, between old forms of society molded around capitalism and new forms of society that prefigure what comes next. And I think anybody working in design, HCI space right now, probably can understand the gist of that, which is like, we're, I think, all actively thinking about and maybe creating these new possibilities, these new ways in which social relations could exist. And yet those things do kind of bump up against and sometimes get sort of like trapped or stuck, as it were, with models of sort of hierarchical forms of value creation or ownership that make it difficult for, I think, some of the emergent possibilities to really begin to flourish. So, that's all fine and well, maybe, but like, what the hell does it have to do with design? Well, I think it's I return a lot to these three words. I think, it's three big ideas, which is like, what are the logics, the structures, and the subjectivities? Maybe fancy, expensive words here, but like what is it that we think we are doing as designers, particularly as we are now, not designers of things, but perhaps UX designers? Like, what do we tell ourselves, or what do we understand is kind of the thinking about what it is that we're producing and why we're producing it and for whom. What are the structures that we have that support that kind of logic for our discipline? And that can be education or professional organizations or particularly named methods or successful stories. And what are the subjectivities that those produce? Like, how do we then see ourselves as being a part of a kind of, social experience that has to do with what we used to call maybe clients and users and consumers, and where that also might go under a different sort of a different economic logic. And so all of this is to take the notion that an economic system has a certain kind of thinking to it, and that certain kind of thinking can also seep into lots of other spaces that might on the face of it have seemingly nothing to do with economy. But I think what it starts to ask is, and I think that, on the one hand, designers have just, the 20 years that I've been practicing, really moved up in a lot of ways into positions of power. When I was an undergraduate student, it was all about, designers were clamoring for a seat at the table, whatever that meant, but just having like decision-making power in large organizations, and seeing the way that UX and design strategy has moved into finance, insurance, healthcare, and like, of course, in the tech industry, we are like really directing, I think, a lot of possibilities. And are we aware of that paradigm, or what do we think about that new paradigm, or how do we articulate that paradigm as it is, I think, distinctly different from the one that UX kind of, the design in general, I guess, professional design practices kind of emerged out of. And so, I mean, what I'm really, I think, asking us to think about is what are the ways in which we might believe individually or collectively or as a field that that the kind of logic, structures, or subjectivities of doing UX design in some ways might still be trapped in sort of outmoded logics. What does the update look like? Outmoded structures, what does the update look like, and so on. Okay, so what the hell do we do about that? That sounds, sounds like a big problem. And so what I have put forth in the book anyway is this notion that I think there are 4 really important kind of pillars to this version or this vision of a post-capitalist approach to design that I've been thinking about and talking about, and it has to do with like these 4 different areas that I believe or I see as being mutually reinforcing. And part of the point of this is a lot. I mean, it's like a pretty big proposal, pretty bold proposal, which is to say we're going to reorient our discipline towards a different kind of thinking, a different kind of, we're going to take accountability for the political economy of design, and we're going to steer it in a particular way. And I think it would be very difficult to do all of it at the same time. And so on the one hand, it's acknowledging like, if you're really focusing on, how does working as a UX designer help support and maintain community economies? And I'm really working on degrowth, not just material degrowth, but thinking about the energy expense and the carbon footprint of all of our, digital, products and services, that we find new leverage points for working when you're focused on one thing and I'm focused on the other. We find new leverage points that begin to shift the territory of what it means for us to be designers working in this space. So these 4 pillars in the kind of around the bullseye are kind of naming those kind of broad principles of change. And then it's also acknowledging that we work at different scales. So at any given moment as a designer, you may be working on several projects, but you're also participating in some kind of practice. It might be a studio or an independent practice or a consultancy or part of a team in a huge corporation. But how do you make those decisions about how work is done, how outside vendors or freelancers or developers or fabricators or professional services are hired or made use of? And then at the biggest scale, we are all participating inside something that is a discipline, has some kind of disciplinary structures and supports and boundaries. So how are we sort of feeding into transition inside the disciplinary space? So based on those 4 strategies at those 3 levels, I've named what I believe to be 12 specific strategies. So at the intersection of each principle and each kind of level, there are these named strategies, which they're all in the book, so you can see it. And I think the good news is it's already happening. So I wanted to share, there's like several case studies in here, and they go in kind of a lot of different directions. But I see some really, I think, interesting things happening around material production, thinking about how objects get produced. And so everything from kind of like looking historically at someone like Enzo Mari, who was a pretty radical Italian designer, believing everybody should be able to build their own furniture and be their own designers and that kind of thing, to my friends Alice and Gavin Monroe, who are actually figured out how to grow chairs and grow tables. I mean, they're it's totally crazy, but they're like growing trees and coppicing them into making furniture, like completely removing, the industry from industrial design, to the huge range of possibilities around biotextiles and even, post-consumer or post-production waste. So there's a group in Detroit named Thing that's like, it's not just that they're collecting post-industrial or post-consumer waste and finding new ways to use it, but they're creating all kinds of experimental new tools to do that work. And I think that's what matters. So none of this is post-capitalist in and of itself, but as soon as we start seeing completely new models of production, then we start to think about how that produces a new kind of political economy around the people that are doing that. In the space of what I've called auto-industrial production, we know, like, 3D printing is a thing, and a thing that has also been, largely commodified in a lot of ways. But I think there are also kind of an ecology of projects that are going on that are trying to really push towards this other kind of auto-productive model. And so Adam Boyer, who's been part of this RepRap project for a couple decades now, is trying to really put into practice this kind of an old idea from von Neumann about self-replicating machines. The idea of being able to make a machine that can make itself. If you can do that, then you can make machines that can make basically anything you might need. And so plugging that into, things we already have, platforms like Thingiverse or whatever, but also thinking about like, well, what's the environmental impact of this kind of thing? And so I think it starts to plug into other projects like Filabot, which is looking at how post-consumer plastics can be repurposed into filament, and looking at social enterprises that are looking at how do we, acknowledge that there are many people in many places in the world in like really pretty dire social and economic conditions that are doing a great service environmentally by picking through trash, by recycling metals, by collecting things that can be repurposed. How do we recognize the value in that, increase the sort of value, like help those people move up the value chain in terms of the work that they're already doing, and create viable livelihoods that moves it from being this like extra economic or sort of tertiary activity into something that's really connected to an auto industrial system. And then there's just like, how do we work? Like what kind of organizations do we work in? What's the gap or the hierarchy between, the newest person and the person who started the company or whose ideas started it or whatever. And we have all kinds of examples of, cooperative practices and thinking about P2P opportunities. So, the whole open source movement, I think, has still tons of potential in it, even as it has shown some limitations. I acknowledge here a group called COTEC, which is a confederation of cooperatives in the UK, which are many sort of small tech companies that are worker owned. So a few people, but they've confederated so they can work on much bigger projects together. So they can really like scale up or down, but everybody involved is an owner of this enterprise and has a vote in the way things are done. The P2P Foundation has really, I think, spread knowledge and possibilities around what peer-to-peer technical systems can do for people. And I think the DESIS network is doing some really interesting work. You guys may be familiar with that. It's kind of a global network, primarily based in design schools. There's one at Carnegie Mellon, partnering design schools with local communities to think about peer-to-peer urbanism or peer-to-peer service design, as it were. So the example here is the Latham Street Commons project that the DESIS lab at Carnegie Mellon did some years ago. So I take all of that and put it into these guidelines, which I hope are like starting points for anybody interested in this to imagine what it would be like to enact these principles and how to enact them in this kind of like increasing scale of the layers. And so, these are just a couple of examples. Again, I think there's 60 plus of these. I phrase these guidelines all as how might we questions. So thinking it's something you could ask yourself, many times within a project or within a practice. Those are all on the website. It's something I would really love to continue to test and maybe expand this as a resource so that each one of those questions might have more material and more background to go with it. So if anybody's like interested in this and you want to test some and tell me that they work or they don't work or how they might work better, I would really love to talk about that and see where it goes. Okay, thank you so much. I know it went a little longer than I expected, but I hope that gave the overview.
We can move into like questions, more of like a casual discussion at this point.
I guess thanks so much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. See a lot of relevance to the thesis research I'm doing right now on mutual aid groups and the alternative systems they're building. Also anti-capitalist or post-capitalist ways of organizing labor and resources. So I found it really interesting to kind of think through the role of design, because sometimes I feel like, is it, the design is so entrenched with capitalism. What is the, how do we see these things through design, and the fact that design has that history, does that make it, does that alter our view on how to do this work? But sorry, that was a comment. The question, I guess, I was very curious to know, in your chats with, you mentioned you'd talked to folks at Google and you'd done this presentation with them. I was very curious to know, like, what were some of their reflections as designers embedded in a very capitalistic machine? And I was also curious why they invited you. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I will say, I guess I'll say a couple things. I think that, I was surprised. I'm pretty critical of Google in the book. But like, I think I have been surprised by how what's the right word? How, I don't want to, well, yeah, I would say how welcome this conversation has been at places I didn't really expect it. I mean, on top of this, I've been asked to come, consult with consultancies and people that are doing work for IKEA and like other like really big, I mean, part of me, the cynical part of me is like, okay, everyone's just hedging their bets, right? Like if the world's really moving in this way, how do we survive? But I also think that if I'm talking to people who are in the space of design in some way or future strategies in some way, I think I'm also talking to human beings who share the kinds of concerns that I have and the kinds of concerns I see in my students all the time. Like, what am I doing if I'm studying design right now? Like, what the hell world am I participating in? And so, if we think about, and again, we have to be careful. I mean, design, designers love to conflate, like design can do everything. And, we can't, not by ourselves, but we can be really influential, I think, and we can be very persuasive. And I think that when we find ourselves in situations where we can, do one of the things we do best, which is find a better way, then I think we can apply it in ways that go beyond a better way to make a product or a better way to, squeeze more data out of this or that. And so how do we conceive of a better way to work with external developers as a corporation, for example? Is it all about like, how do we sort of milk them just a little bit, even while we keep them alive? I don't know. I mean, and there are all kinds of contradictions here. I mean, what does the benefits of a really, really flexible labor force are great for a lot of corporations and they're great for a lot of people sometimes, but there are downsides to that too, right? Which is like suddenly, everybody's a precarious worker, right? In those kinds of situations. So as far as like Google's conversation, I mean, yeah, I don't, I think I was talking to a lot of, designers who recognize they work for this really huge, largely capitalist organization. And they're grappling with these questions themselves. I was quite thrilled to be able to participate in a conversation that sort of steered to thinking about what, for an organization that does have a kind of history with open source development, which from what I understand has lived largely in the engineering space at Google in terms of sort of its culture and kind of history. Like what could an open source model of UX research or UX design look like? And I give some sort of nods to this, I think, in the book, which is like, surely anytime anybody's doing any kind of deep, either ethnographic research or doing UX research specifically, you learn a lot of things that really don't end up being relevant. Like you learn about people's needs or desires that may not be relevant to whatever, product or service you're working on. What do you do with that, right? Like you found out like, hey, I see a need. People have this need. Like, what would it look like to be able to circulate some of those ideas into the world, even if you can't, you can't act on it in your present position? What would it mean for, I don't know, let's say Google to, create a kind of platform for thinking about what open source looks like in the context of UX research and design? So again, it's like it's one little direction that could emerge from that. But if you start sort of thinking in that kind of direction, then you are operating under a different logic than a capitalist logic that has to do with ownership of really abstract forms of property.
Thank you.
Is that I don't know that.
No, that was great. Yeah, I really I think there's a lot we can learn from movements like open source on how we can collaborate on different alternative models of working and producing things. So
Yeah.
And I think designers, I don't know if we're behind or if we're like, I'm just curious about why designers haven't kind of followed that trajectory, like open source developers have. And maybe it's the history of design that has led us in a certain path.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think the trajectory I mean, again, who's the we here, I guess, but there's there is a strong hegemonic trajectory in design practices that I think we have not figured out really how to shake. And I think that we have, I think we've adapted well. I mean, some designers are doing really well these days, like we found economically ways to really, I mean, I think, you can, I think I noted in the book, last time I checked, like the highest paid UX designers are at Netflix right now. They're doing pretty well, you know what I mean? But it's like, can you imagine like if that was directed to something else? I mean, like Netflix is great, right? But like, can you imagine that kind of potential directed at something else? It's really kind of amazing to think what could happen.
Totally. Yeah.
In the book, do you talk at all about like dilution of movements that tend to happen over time? Like when you come out with something that's like new language or a new way of thinking, especially if you're presenting it to a corporation, how you prevent it from getting co-opted or like diluted in the process?
Yeah, well, I think that, I mean, I acknowledge that in the way in which, and there's like a long history to this criticism, I guess, of, I don't know if it's a criticism, but this observation that, yeah, I mean, I'm going to try not to keep using the big C word too much, but I can't get it around. Like the way that capitalism just has this really uncanny ability to absorb and co-opt and commodify things that are even completely antithetical to it. And so
Yeah.
the Che Guevara t-shirt phenomenon, it's just like,
Yeah.
And I give this in the context of a couple of, subcultural movements like, punk and hip hop. I mean, these are cultural movements that were rather antithetical to capitalism, but it's certainly people have figured out ways to make a lot of money off of it. And I think that, one of the more interesting, I guess maybe one interesting model, and it's, something I've talked to some of my PhD cohorts about too, is like, when the Black Panthers emerged as a social organization social and political organization in the United States, there were two like parts of their movement. One was about providing, free meals, free medical assistance, like basically mutual aid care inside, neighborhoods and cities like Detroit, but all around the country. And the other one was self-defense. I mean, the two things that kind of had to go hand in hand was something to protect the mutual aid from being co-opted or destroyed from the outside. And so I think that I think it is just an ongoing, it's just one of those ongoing challenges, which is understanding that, as a collective or as individuals working on these kinds of projects, like that is a risk, and that you have to keep the agenda really clear. And I don't think it's an all or nothing kind of thing. I think it is murky, but I think it's trying to keep your eye on it. And so, I'll give a personal example that has emerged since I wrote the book. I argue in the book that I think there's some big challenges, some big problems in the way that design has become close to, sort of invention and technological innovation. I've been down the path, working in university research labs of, creating intellectual property around things. I will never do it again. I mean, I just think I find that the whole like university research becoming commodified in the form of IP is just so bogus. And it's usually also, frankly, protecting something that's so stupid that's not even worth the time or the effort to like protect it. But it's just this crazy, I guess, like casino mentality. Like maybe this one will hit the jackpot, But the other part of it is NDAs. We get involved in projects and we're signing contracts and say we can't talk to anybody about what we're doing. So after the book comes out, I get this opportunity to do some consulting on a project that I think has some really good social benefits to it. If done well, I want to participate in it. There's an NDA. I was like, okay, well, so I had to like push back against it. And again, it was difficult, but it was surprising how exactly the things that I was arguing were important to me to not get locked up He's like, you are working for other clients. I understand that they want to protect this, but as a researcher, I have to be able to share the methods. So I can't do this project if I can't share how we did it with other people so they can do the same thing, which is, I guess that's kind of like a open source idea, right? Like I'm not going to give you, I can't give you everything because that's what they're using, but you can do this too, and let me show you exactly how. And so I'll be really interested to see how that happens when I turn around and publish the methods that we co-developed, which is very explicitly written into the NDA now that Matt can share the methods that we developed in this process, just because of like pushing back on that a little bit.
I was ready to not walk. I've just like not been able to, like I'm still thinking about, like an open source community about design for designers, UX researchers. So this is not a question, this is just a comment. But so this semester I'm actually working with, I don't know if you know her, Laura Dabish in HCI, who works a lot on open source platforms, a lot on GitHub, Wikipedia. And one of the main things that her lab is working on is inclusivity, gender diversity in open source platforms.
Yeah.
And let's say if we look at GitHub, it is extremely, I don't know what's the opposite of diverse, but like undiverse, indiverse, very exclusive, very male dominated. The extent of, I think, gender diversity that we get is like very language specific, and it goes up to like 13% for women in Python language. Otherwise, it's like as horrible as 3%, 5%. So I don't know, I'm just excited to imagine that perhaps an open source platform for UX designers, UX researchers, just like designers in general, perhaps for once we would have not, I don't know, I'm just hoping and like being extremely optimistic about it, but hopefully we wouldn't have this diversity, inclusion problems that we're facing right now in other open source platforms, were it to be for, the field of design. So I think, I'm just surprised that I never thought about OSS, open source softwares for, design. Why does it have to be very proprietary to coding, programming? But I don't know. More I think about it, more I'm, intrigued to figure out how else can it be done.
Yeah, great. I hope you find some ways to do it and let me know. I agree with you. I think, just to say, on that note a little bit, I think that one of the one of the debates or one of the challenges around commons in general. So thinking about, commons as shared resources that also operate with some sense of like any range of practices that in which people can take and people can give, and this can be very structured, like it's your turn to do this, it's my turn to do this, or it's sort of like, give as much as you can, take as much as you need kind of thing. So in the huge range of commons and commoning practices, how do we acknowledge that not everybody enters the space with the same like social capital or same economic capital or same cultural capital? And how do we acknowledge that? Like, if you were to make a commons of even like a community garden or something like that, and affluent retired people have all kinds of time to hang out in the garden. People that are like working really hard to like, pay the bills don't have the time to give into it. How could a commons operate to acknowledge the diversity of needs while also acknowledging the diversity of assets? And that's what a lot of the kind of community economic research from folks like J.K. Gibson Graham is aimed at, to try to uncover, a variety of assets and a variety of needs that are outside the sort of purely economic. So it's a little bit tangential to what you're saying, I think, in terms of participation, but it's also acknowledging that, that the ability to use or make use of, assets that may have been produced by people that are part of social groups that have all kinds of privilege, hopefully are opportunities to also balance the scales inside that kind of practice around the commons, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So thinking about the fact that, you know, contributions, diversity of contributions, I think is really important, because that gives us a diversity of ideas and things to work with. And those perspectives are maybe baked in to the diversity of ideas that are put into the commons. But also, how does the use of the commons become something that can help level the playing field in some way?
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of Stefan's work, Stefan Cooper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I you know, I haven't met Stefan, but I've heard a few times from Terry Irwin that we should chat about this, because it sounds like he's really a commons
He is completely a commons person.
commons guy. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting. Awesome. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Anybody else have any final questions or comments they want to make?